In the history of global commerce, 6 distinct currencies have held the title of global reserve over the last 500 years. Here's something that should grab our attention. The average tenure of dominance is roughly 94 years. The US dollar has been the official global anchor since 1944. If you do the math, we are statistically overdue for a reset. But here's what most people don't understand. Currencies don't die of old age. They are murdered by a specific mechanism that we can trace back to a hotel ballroom in New Hampshire. Think about this for a moment. Every empire in history believed their currency would last forever. The Spanish real dominated for a century. The Dutch guilder ruled the waves of commerce. The French franc financed kingdoms. Yet each one eventually surrendered its crown, not through invasion or war, but through a predictable financial pattern that plays out in 7 distinct phases. We've seen this cycle before. And right now, our dollar is following the exact same path. Let me take you back to July 1st, 1944. While American soldiers fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, another battle was unfolding in the grand ballroom of the Mount Washington Hotel in Breton Woods, New Hampshire. This wasn't a battle fought with rifles and tanks. This was a battle for the future of global finance. And the stakes were higher than any military campaign. 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered in that mountain resort. The British delegation arrived with a desperate mission. They needed to save the pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency since Napoleon's defeat in 1815. Leading their charge was the most brilliant economist of the era, John Maynard Keynes himself. But Keynes walked into that room with empty hands. The American delegation, led by a Treasury official named Harry Dexter White, held all the leverage. Specifically, they held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves locked in vaults beneath Manhattan. The negotiations weren't really negotiations at all. They were terms of surrender. To understand what happened in that hotel ballroom, you need to understand the 3 phases that had already sealed Britain's fate. These phases form a pattern that repeats throughout monetary history, and we need to recognize them because our dollar is currently in the exact same cycle. Phase 1 is what we call hard money. This is when a currency is backed by something tangible, something you can hold in your hand. For Britain, this meant the gold standard. Before World War I, the British pound was immutable. Fixed at £1 equals $4.86. That peg was sacred. It represented trust, stability, and the full faith of the world's greatest empire. Phase 2 arrives when paper claims replace the actual hard money. Instead of carrying gold, people carry paper promises that supposedly represent gold. The system still works because everyone believes they can redeem their paper for metal if they choose to. Britain operated in this phase throughout the 19th century, and it was glorious. The pound financed railways across continents, built factories in distant colonies, and underwrote the Industrial Revolution itself. Then came Phase 3, where debt expansion overwhelms the system. This is where the mathematics of empire begin to work against you. When you're the global reserve currency, the world needs more and more of your money to facilitate growing trade. But there's a problem. The amount of gold you have is finite, while the demand for your currency keeps growing. So, you start issuing more paper claims than you have gold to back them. Britain hit this wall during World War I. The war was horrifically expensive, costing roughly $44 billion in today's money. Britain couldn't pay for it with gold alone. On September 19, 1914, just weeks after the war began, Britain quietly suspended the gold standard. They assured everyone it was temporary, just an emergency measure until the fighting stopped. But the fighting didn't stop. It dragged on for 4 brutal years. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Britain was drowning in debt. They tried to restore the gold standard in 1925, desperately attempting to return to Phase 2 and rebuild trust. It was too late. They'd printed too much money, made too many promises, created too many paper claims on gold that no longer existed in sufficient quantities. The global markets knew it. In 1931, facing a run on their gold reserves, Britain abandoned the gold standard permanently. Within months, the pound crashed by 30% against other currencies. Global trust shattered. The era of sterling dominance was effectively over, though it would take another 13 years for the official transfer of power. During World War II, Britain found itself in an impossible position. They needed American ships, American planes, American weapons, and American food. President Franklin Roosevelt created the Lend-Lease program, which sounds generous until you read the terms. Britain received $43 billion worth of supplies, but they had to pay for much of it. By the time victory was declared in 1945, the United Kingdom owed the United States $4.3 billion. That might not sound catastrophic until you adjust it for economic scale. In today's terms, that debt represented roughly $70 billion of economic output. Britain was broken. Their cities lay in ruins. Their treasury was empty. Their gold reserves had been shipped to America to pay for the war. And now, American diplomats were ready to dictate terms. This brings us back to that ballroom in New Hampshire. Keynes arrived with a proposal for a new global currency called the Bancor, which would be managed by an international institution. It was elegant, balanced, and designed to prevent any single nation from dominating world finance the way Britain once had. The Americans said no. Harry Dexter White presented a different plan. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar. If you wanted to participate in global trade, you needed dollars. If you wanted dollars, you had to sell your goods to America or earn them through approved channels. This was phase 2 of the cycle, but this time with America at the center. The British delegates knew exactly what was happening. They were watching their empire's financial crown being transferred to a new head. They had no choice but to accept. The Breton Woods Agreement became official on July 22, 1944. In that moment, the Exorbitant Privilege passed from London to Washington. Britain had created this privilege during their century of dominance. Now they were handing the weapon to someone else, fully aware of how powerful it was and what it could do. But here's what should concern every American watching this. The British didn't lose their reserve status because they wanted to. They didn't voluntarily give up the immense benefits of being the world's currency. They lost it because they followed a predictable pattern through those 3 phases. Hard money became paper claims, became debt explosion, became collapse. And that same pattern is visible in our dollar's history right now. After Breton Woods, America enjoyed something that no nation in history had ever possessed at such scale. We had the exorbitant privilege. That phrase was coined by a furious French finance minister in the 1960s, and it perfectly captures what we're talking about. When your currency is the global reserve, you can print money to buy real goods from other countries. Think about that for a moment. We could create dollars out of nothing and exchange them for German cars, Japanese electronics, and Saudi oil. The rest of the world had to earn their dollars through sweat and production. We just had to turn on the printing press. But here's the trap that comes with this privilege, and it's a trap that eventually catches every reserve currency. It's called the Triffin dilemma, named after an economist who predicted this exact problem in 1959. Robert Triffin warned Congress that our system contained a fatal contradiction. To supply the world with enough dollars for growing global trade, America must run persistent trade deficits. We must send more dollars out than we receive back. But the more dollars we create and export, the less each dollar is worth. Eventually, the world accumulates so many dollars that they begin to doubt whether we actually have enough gold to back them all. Triffin predicted the entire crisis 15 years before it happened. Congress ignored him completely. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, everything seemed fine. American factories were humming. Our economy was dominant. The dollar was as good as gold because we said it was, and we had the reserves to prove it. But slowly, quietly, the mathematics began to turn against us. Every year, we printed more dollars to pay for imports and military bases overseas. Every year, foreign central banks accumulated more of our currency. And every year, a few of them would show up at the Treasury Department and politely ask to exchange their paper dollars for actual gold at the promised rate of $35 per ounce. The gold started flowing out of Fort Knox. In 1945, we held 20,000 metric tons of gold, representing about 70% of the world's official reserves. By 1960, that number had fallen to 16,000 tons. Still comfortable, but the trend was undeniable. By 1965, we were down to 14,000 tons, and the outflow was accelerating. Then France decided to call our bluff. President Charles de Gaulle made a calculated decision that would change financial history. He announced that France would begin converting its dollar reserves into gold at every opportunity. This wasn't a small move. France held billions in dollar reserves, and de Gaulle sent French naval vessels to New York Harbor to physically collect gold bars from the Federal Reserve. Other countries watched this carefully. If France was nervous about the dollar's gold backing, maybe they should be nervous too. Spain started redeeming dollars for gold. Germany began asking questions. Switzerland increased its conversions. What started as French defiance was becoming a bank run in slow motion. Between 1965 and 1971, U.S. gold reserves collapsed from over 15,000 metric tons to just 8,100 metric tons. We'd lost nearly half our gold in 6 years. The mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. At the rate gold was leaving, we'd be completely empty within a decade. And there were still hundreds of billions of dollars held overseas, all of which technically had the right to be redeemed for gold. President Richard Nixon faced an impossible choice. He could keep the gold window open and watch Fort Knox drain to zero, which would be financial catastrophe. Or he could close the window, break our promise, and hope the world wouldn't lose faith in the dollar completely. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on national television and announced the temporary suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. He promised it was temporary. He said it was necessary to defend against currency speculators. He assured Americans that the dollar would remain strong. That temporary suspension has now lasted over 50 years. The dollar immediately devalued by 8% against major currencies. Foreign governments were furious. They'd been holding dollars specifically because those dollars were supposed to be backed by gold. Now they were holding paper backed only by American promises. The Breton Woods system had collapsed. We'd moved from Phase 2 to Phase 3 practically overnight. But here's what should amaze you about what happened next. The dollar didn't collapse. We should have lost our reserve status right then. We'd broken the fundamental promise that gave the dollar its value. Yet somehow, American economic dominance continued. The exorbitant privilege survived. How did we pull this off? The answer lies in the most brilliant geopolitical maneuver of the 20th century, and it happened in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. In July 1974, Treasury Secretary William Simon boarded a classified flight to Jeddah. His mission was urgent and secret. The oil crisis had just devastated Western economies. Arab nations were suddenly flush with billions in oil revenue. These petrodollars were threatening to destabilize everything. If oil-producing nations decided to price their product in German marks or Japanese yen, the dollar's global dominance would evaporate. Simon met with Saudi Crown Prince Fahd and proposed a deal that would reshape the world economy. The terms were straightforward. The United States would buy Saudi oil and provide military protection for the kingdom. We'd sell them advanced weapons and guarantee their security against regional threats. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would agree to 2 critical conditions. First, all Saudi oil sales would be denominated exclusively in U.S. dollars. Not marks, not yen, not gold, dollars only. Second, Saudi Arabia would recycle its oil profits by investing them back into U.S. Treasury securities. They would loan us back the money we paid them for oil. The Saudis agreed. Other OPEC nations followed Saudi Arabia's lead. Suddenly, any country that wanted to buy oil needed dollars. Japan needed dollars. Germany needed dollars. Brazil needed dollars. The entire world needed a constant supply of American currency just to keep their economies running. We'd replaced gold backing with oil backing. Instead of promising that dollars could be exchanged for metal, we'd created a system where dollars were required to purchase the most essential commodity on Earth. It was genius. It was also Phase 4 of the currency cycle, where the reserve currency becomes backed by geopolitical arrangements rather than hard assets. This petrodollar system gave us an enormous advantage. We could run massive trade deficits because foreign nations had no choice but to accept our currency. When we bought Japanese cars or Chinese electronics, those countries received dollars. They couldn't spend those dollars at home because dollars aren't legal tender in Tokyo or Beijing, so they invested them back into U.S. treasuries, effectively loaning us back our own printed money. This created a feedback loop. We print dollars to buy imports. Exporters receive those dollars and buy our bonds. The bond purchases keep our interest rates low. Low interest rates allow us to print even more dollars. The cycle continues. For America, this meant we could finance both massive military spending and consumer abundance simultaneously. We maintained military bases in 150 countries. We fought wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We built interstate highways and subsidized suburban development. And we did it all while our citizens enjoyed the world's highest standard of living. The rest of the world paid for it. Every time we printed dollars to finance our spending, we exported inflation to countries holding our currency. Developing nations watched their savings erode in value as we increased the money supply. They had no choice but to accept it. Without dollars, they couldn't buy oil. Without oil, their economies would collapse. Through the 1980s and 1990s, this system seemed invincible. The Soviet Union fell. American technology dominated. Our financial markets were the deepest and most liquid in the world. The petrodollar arrangement was so entrenched that even suggesting an alternative seemed absurd. But remember the pattern. Phase 4 never lasts forever. The debt keeps growing. The promises keep multiplying. And eventually, the mathematics overwhelm the geopolitics. We'd learned how to export our inflation and extend our privilege beyond what should have been possible when Nixon closed the gold window. But we hadn't repealed economic gravity. We'd simply delayed it. And with every passing year, the delays became more expensive. The debts grew larger. The promises became harder to keep. The number of dollars circulating globally began to dwarf the actual productive capacity of our economy. We were setting the stage for Phase 5, where trust begins to crack and alternatives start emerging. We just didn't realize it yet. We were too busy enjoying the exorbitant privilege to notice that the same mechanisms that destroyed sterling were now working against the dollar. The warning signs were already appearing. We just weren't paying attention. Let me show you exactly when Phase 5 began. The date was February 28, 2022. Most Americans were watching news coverage of the war in Ukraine. But in the marble corridors of central banks around the world, a different kind of shockwave was spreading. The United States and European Union had just announced the freezing of roughly $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves. Think about what that means for a moment. Russia had spent decades accumulating dollars and euros. They'd earned that money through oil sales, natural gas exports, and trade. They stored it in the Western financial system because that's what you're supposed to do. Dollars and euros are the safe assets, the stable reserves that central banks hold for emergencies. In a single weekend, those reserves became inaccessible, frozen, confiscated, gone. Now, you might say Russia deserved it. You might support the sanctions. But here's what matters for the dollar's future. Every central bank governor in China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey watch that freeze happen and ask themselves the same question. If geopolitical disagreements can vaporize our reserves, are our dollars actually safe? This was the moment we weaponized the financial system, and in doing so, we triggered the phase that has destroyed every reserve currency in history. Phase 5 is where trust begins to crack, where alternatives emerge, and where the mathematical impossibility of the debt finally becomes impossible to ignore. The search for alternatives started immediately. Within months of the Russian sanctions, we began seeing unprecedented shifts in global finance. China and Brazil announced they would settle trade directly in yuan and reals, bypassing the dollar entirely. India started buying Russian oil in rupees. Saudi Arabia began discussing oil sales in yuan for Chinese customers. These weren't just symbolic gestures. These were concrete arrangements to conduct billions in trade without touching the dollar system. But the clearest signal came from an unexpected source. Central banks around the world started buying gold at a pace we haven't seen in over 50 years. In 2022, global central banks purchased 1,136 metric tons of gold. That's the highest level since 1967, which, if you remember your history, was right before the first gold pool collapse that preceded Nixon's closing of the gold window. China has been particularly aggressive. They've added gold to their official reserves for 18 consecutive months as of mid-2024. Poland increased its gold reserves by 130 tons in 2 years. Singapore is buying. Turkey is buying. Even countries that were traditionally comfortable holding primarily dollars are now diversifying rapidly into hard assets. This is the smart money voting with their vaults. Central bankers don't make these moves casually. They're not speculators chasing trends. They're institutions responsible for protecting their nation's wealth. And they're collectively deciding that the dollar system has become too risky to trust completely. Meanwhile, our debt situation has crossed into territory that would have seemed impossible just 2 decades ago. The U.S. national debt now exceeds $35 trillion, but that number is so large it's almost meaningless. Let me give you a metric that should grab your attention. In 2024, the annualized cost of just servicing this debt, paying the interest alone, crossed $1 trillion for the first time in American history. $1 trillion in interest payments. That's more than our entire Defense Department budget, more than we spend on Medicare, more than all federal spending on education, infrastructure, and scientific research combined. We're now spending $1 trillion per year just to pay interest on money we've already borrowed. And here's the terrifying mathematics. That interest cost is accelerating. When interest rates were near zero during the 2010s, we could borrow almost for free. But the Federal Reserve has raised rates to fight inflation. Every time the government rolls over existing debt or issues new debt, it's doing so at these higher rates. The Congressional Budget Office projects that, by 2030, interest payments could reach $1.4 trillion annually. By 2034, they estimate $2 trillion per year. At some point, the math simply doesn't work anymore. You can't have interest payments consuming an ever-growing share of your budget without eventually losing the ability to fund anything else. This is the debt spiral. This is Phase 5 manifesting in real time. Some economists argue that we can grow our way out of this problem. They say that if GDP grows faster than the debt, the ratios will improve. But we've been trying that strategy for 3 decades now. Our debt to GDP ratio was 35% in 1980. Today it's over 120% and climbing. The growth isn't coming fast enough to outpace the debt accumulation. Other economists suggest we can simply monetize the debt, having the Federal Reserve buy treasury bonds with newly created money. But that's how you create inflation. That's how you destroy the purchasing power of everyone holding dollars. That's how you move from Phase 5 into Phase 6, which is outright currency debasement. We're caught in a trap. We can't raise taxes enough to cover the spending without crushing economic growth. We can't cut spending without facing political revolt. We can't let interest rates rise too high without making the debt unsustainable. And we can't print money to solve the problem without triggering inflation. This is the same trap that caught Britain in the 1920s and 1930s, the same trap that caught every reserve currency before us. The mathematics of empire eventually overwhelmed the benefits of the exorbitant privilege. Now, let me be clear about something important. This isn't the apocalypse. The dollar isn't going to zero. America isn't disappearing. But we are entering a transition from a unipolar financial system to a multipolar one. Instead of the dollar handling 70% of global trade settlements, that number is likely to decline toward 40 or 50% over the next decade. Instead of one dominant reserve currency, we'll see a basket approach where the euro, yuan, and potentially digital currencies share more of the burden. For the average American, this transition means real consequences. Your savings held in dollars will lose purchasing power faster than the official inflation numbers suggest. Fixed income investments like bonds will struggle. Import prices will rise as the dollar weakens. That vacation to Europe will become more expensive. That Japanese car will cost more. Your retirement planning assumptions based on historical dollar strength will need adjustment. But there will also be winners in this transition. Those holding hard assets like real estate, commodities, and precious metals will see their wealth preserved better. Companies with pricing power and international revenue streams will adapt. Emerging markets that have built alternative payment systems will gain negotiating power and economic sovereignty. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanded to include Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and others, are actively constructing alternatives to dollar-based settlement. They're creating development banks that compete with the IMF. They're building payment systems that bypass SWIFT. They're signing bilateral trade agreements in local currencies. This isn't happening in some distant future. This is happening right now, in real time, accelerated by our decision to weaponize the financial system. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The British pound didn't vanish when it lost reserve status. Britain is still here. London is still a financial center. But the pound lost roughly 60% of its purchasing power in the 3 decades following World War II. British citizens who kept their wealth in sterling-denominated assets watched their standard of living decline relative to the rest of the world. We're watching the same mechanism play out with our dollar. The warning lights of Phase 5 are flashing red. Debt monetization is accelerating. Weaponization has triggered the search for alternatives. Central banks are hedging their bets. The mathematics are becoming unsustainable. The question isn't whether the system will change. The question is how you're positioned when it does. Are you holding assets that will preserve value through a currency transition? Do you understand that the dollar's role is shrinking, not expanding? Have you diversified beyond the assumption that American financial dominance is permanent? The exorbitant privilege was extraordinary while it lasted. It allowed our generation to enjoy a standard of living that was artificially elevated by our currency's global role. But privileges aren't permanent. They're earned through strength and maintained through trust. When the strength fades and trust cracks, the privilege goes to someone else. We're not the first nation to learn this lesson. We're just the most recent. The pattern has played out 6 times before, over the past 5 centuries. Each time, the dominant currency believed it was different, that it was special, that the rules didn't apply. And each time, the 7 phases played out anyway. Hard money became paper claims, became debt expansion, became geopolitical backing, became weaponization, became currency crisis, became eventual replacement. We're currently between Phase 5 and Phase 6. The next few years will determine how quickly we move through the remaining phases and what the multipolar financial system looks like when the transition is complete. The smart money is already adapting. The question is whether you are too.